How can we maximize our clients' input into services? That is one of the items that we talk about today in episode 135 of the Autism Outreach Podcast. I had a wonderful conversation with Dr. Cody Morris. We discuss assent, we discuss choice, we discuss so many things that are very important, whether you're listening as a speech therapist or a BCBA or other professional. If you're not familiar with Dr. Cody Morris, he is really a bright spot in the field. He is an assistant professor, graduate program director of behavior analysis, and chair of the IRB at South Virginia University. And he earned his doctorate in psychology, behavior analysis at Western Michigan University. And he shares with us his journey into the field, which I always love hearing everybody's journey into the field. And his is really interesting. The overarching goal of Cody's research and clinical focus is improving the practice of behavior analysis. And he has two major concentrations. The first and primary concentration is improving assessment and treatment methodologies for severely challenging behavior in clinical settings. And the second concentration is addressing organizational issues related to the delivery of behavior analysis. He has an amazing amount of research. If you just go to the BACB website and you look up Dr. Cody Morris, wow, he is doing such great work in the field. And he has an upcoming paper coming out about assent, which I'm very excited to read and to be able to share that information with you. He has published works in prominent behavior analytic journals, including the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis in Practice, and the Journal of Organizational Behavior Management. He's also been a reviewer for many journals, and he is the executive producer and host of the Behavior Analysis in Practice podcast. Without further ado, let's get into my conversation with Dr. Cody Morris.
You're listening to Autism Outreach Podcast, a podcast full of ready-to-use strategies to help those with autism strengthen their communication skills. Here's your host, Rose Griffin of ABA Speech, a speech therapist and board-certified behavior analyst who shares tips you can use in your next therapy session.
Well, thanks so much for joining us on episode 135 of the Autism Outreach Podcast. We have an amazing episode for you today. We have with us Dr. Cody Morris. Thanks so much for joining us, Cody. It's great to have you on.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Before I pressed record, I was chatting about how your amazing work and all the things you're doing in the field, which is so much. And I'm excited for you to kind of share some of the stuff you're doing. Pops up on my LinkedIn. So all my listeners know we're 135 episodes in. So social media is a big part of how I disseminate information. So I think LinkedIn, it might be my favorite. It is a social media platform. I know it's professional, but it is social media. But I do think it's the most professional of all the platforms. So I do enjoy it because I get to see, get to meet people like you, who are doing really cool things in the field. So for those of us that, don't know much about you and your work, can you just tell us, I would love to hear how you got into the field and then maybe to hear about, kind of the work that you're doing now.
Sure. So, we were speaking a little bit about the podcast I host as well, Batcast. And this is like my favorite part of being a podcast host is getting to hear people's backgrounds and stuff. And what I've learned is really like everyone has very different ways of getting into the field. And maybe similar to other people, I sort of fell upon behavior analysis as happenstance. I'd watched the movie Good Will Hunting as a kid or an adolescent and wanted to go into psychology because there's a psychologist in that movie by Robin Williams, right? So I'm like, that's what I want to do. And went to Western Michigan University to study psychology. Western Michigan's program is extremely behavior analytic, like the undergrad program that's more or less one track to behavior analysis. And I was a little angsty toward behavior analysis. I didn't love it initially. I kind of thought, reinforcement, that seems pretty obvious to me that, you're going to repeat things that produced good things previously. And so I just was not taken by it. And I had volunteered on a bunch of research projects to get research assistant experience and to try different things. And I just could not find something to like really draw me in. All the research projects that we're doing were clinical psychology focused, which were cool projects. It just wasn't quite for me.
Right.
But then eventually I took a research methods class with Stephanie Peterson, and that really opened my eyes up to evidence-based practice, systematic evaluation, the dangers of hypothetical constructs, and like so many of the important things that I now know to be sort of behavior analytic research methodology. And in that class, she really converted me to the behavior analytic way of thinking without me even realizing it. Mm-hmm. And this was toward the end of my undergraduate experience, I ended up enrolling in a counseling psychology graduate program because I just wasn't sure. And I thought I did a bunch of research and I didn't really love it. So maybe like counseling, which that particular program was more sort of clinical focused rather than research focused. And I thought, okay, maybe I'll just do this. But the summer heading into that program, I happened to bump into Stephanie Peterson again, and she was telling me about some of the research her students were doing and asked if I would be involved with one of the projects as a research assistant. So I jumped on that the summer heading into that program. And really for the first time when I was on a proper behavior analysis research project, research finally clicked for me. And I was like, oh, like this is how all those things that Stephanie talked about in research methods, this is how all of those things sort of come into fruition and really like show control of studies and identify controlling variables of things and everything like that. And so that research study really got me interested. Nevertheless, I started a counseling program and it just was not for me. And it was very apparent very quickly. Like syllabus week, I realized I had made a mistake.
Oh, wow.
And so I went to meet with Stephanie Peterson, who was the chair of the psychology department at the time. And I said, Stephanie, or Dr. Peterson, I said, I think I may have made a mistake. And she said something along the lines of, yeah, no kidding. Apply to my lab and come be a behavior analyst, basically. And that's what I did. I applied and I joined her lab and worked with her for my master's and PhD. And the rest is history, as they say.
Oh, that's amazing. I love that. And then did you get straight into academia and start on that track?
I did, yeah. So I applied to all sorts of positions when I was wrapping up my PhD. While I was doing my PhD, I'd been working with Stephanie, leading one of her practicum sites. So was essentially functioning as a clinical director of a behavioral consultation organization for my master's and my PhD. Got really into research through that process, got into supervision, and then sort of fell into teaching. There's a period of time where I really didn't want to do teaching, or thought I didn't want to do teaching, but I gotten roped into co-teaching a graduate course.
Right.
And I loved it. And I'm like, okay, I think this is the right track for me. And I applied to a bunch of positions, applied to postdocs, applied to academic positions, applied to clinical jobs, and I sort of happened upon Salve Regina University, which I had never heard of.
Yeah.
It's a small school in a very small state, Rhode Island, and interviewed here and really liked what I heard and saw from the administration. I was going to be, as I was going to be hired, the only behavior analyst here. And so that was a little intimidating, being my first academic position.
Yeah.
But I accepted the position and it's worked out quite well. Really enjoy my time here and everything I get to do.
Oh, that's neat. Yeah. And you are doing, I was just saying before we pressed record, I was just looking at your Vita, your resume, and all I mean, kudos to you because you've done such a great job of keeping track of all your various presentations and all the research that you're doing. And I was feeling very bad about myself because I have done a lot of just presentations, that's what I do. But I am really bad about logging them, but yours are really, I'm like, oh, someday I need to go back. I need to Google my name and see all the things that I have done, but yours is comprehensive. So yeah. And I feel like you are always doing a lot of great stuff with your students too, because I feel like that's what I see on LinkedIn is a lot of your research or, activities that you're doing. So it seems like you're doing so much in the field. And one of the things you talk about a lot of different stuff, but one of the things that we've been talking about a lot here on Autism Outreach is the idea of assent, because I am a speech therapist and a BCBA. And I don't know if you know this, but a lot of speech therapists really have a hard time working with BCBAs. And there's a lot of anti-ABA sentiment in the speech therapy world. And so I like talking about the idea of assent and the things that we're going to talk about today, because I think people that don't understand applied behavior analysis don't understand that these are topics that we talk about a lot. And just like anything, our field is growing and evolving and all the research that's coming out around these topics. But can you give us just kind of a working definition of assent, if that's a new word for people tuning into it?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I talk about assent, I like to talk about it in comparison to consent, because I think most people are familiar with consent as adults that I'm sure are listening to the podcast. They've consented to like a million things in their life. And so consent can be defined as the affirmation that an individual, and this is an important piece here, who is legally authorized gives permission for themselves or another person to participate in a procedure. Mm-hmm. So consent really can be done for someone themselves, or you can potentially consent for someone who would be a ward to you, or someone that you have sort of legal custody of, or have some legal standing, sort of being the guardian of.
Okay. And I think that's how it gets tricky. Were you going to mention something else?
I was just going to say, and then assent, right? So that's consent.
Oh, consent, yes.
Right. Then assent it's similar and it's obviously very related, but assent is the affirmation that an individual who is not legally authorized to provide their own consent is affirming their willingness to engage in a procedure. And so the difference is consent, you have to have sort of legal standing, you have to be an adult, you have to have legal guardianship of yourself, if we're talking about someone with like disabilities or receiving services. And then assent as if someone who has already been given consent for, so if they have a legal guardian and that legal guardian says, yes, they can participate in this procedure, then that person is still given the opportunity to choose. And so it's not an either or, it's an in addition to. So consent is always required. Assent, depending on if there's a legal guardian involved or not, would potentially be required or recommended.
Oh, yeah, I like that, because we did a podcast about this a couple, maybe 15 episodes ago, but it wasn't described in that way. And I do like that, kind of how it's an addition to. And I think sometimes we don't analyze to that. I mean, I do, because I'm a speech therapist and BCBA, but I don't think everybody's analyzing to that extent. So I love that very detailed definition. And I think where it becomes hard for speech therapists and BCBAs, because I am still a practicing clinician and do a lot of consultations, is a lot of times I'm working with students who are not yet speaking, as are a lot of our listeners, probably why they're tuning in to get strategies to help support their students. And a lot of the times our students are not yet speaking. And so I think it can be really hard for us to know, well, how can we obtain this assent from the students that we're working with? Because I'll tell you what, when I put out content that's about, how to help your students engage, and do you have, I was just telling a story about, I did a training about joint attention this week, and I was talking about a client, Hank, obviously that wasn't his name, but that I had 18 years ago. And it was either he did not care about the activities that I planned, or he left the teaching area, and he was like 3. So I think that's kind of where we struggle with, how are our students demonstrating assent, or how do we obtain assent for individuals who are not yet speaking, which now with the incidence rate of autism being 1 in 36, this is really affecting everybody.
Yeah. And I mean, this question, I think in particular, gets to the crux of the complication of this topic in behavior analysis. And this is why I sort of do so much research and focus so much of my time on assent, is unpacking the best way to approach conceptualize assent and to really maximize our clients' input into their own services, right? But to sort of answer your question more directly, when thinking about, okay, how do we begin to approach assent with clients who have significant communication difficulties? Fundamentally, assent is a type of choice, right? And specifically, it's a choice whether to engage in a particular procedure or not. Like, it's that simple. And so a lot of people, I've noticed, sort of conflate assent with, like, for example, setting treatment goals. by all means, clients should be involved with establishing treatment goals as much as possible. It's not assent, though. It's a different type of client involvement in treatment decisions, all of which are incredibly important. So assent is one little piece of that. But assent fundamentally is a choice. And we can evaluate or measure choice a couple of different ways. We can evaluate choice based on someone's verbal statements, which is, sure, I'd love to do that, right? Mm-hmm. Or I don't want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Or we can look at behavior allocation. So we can look at, if given opportunities and maybe setting up an arrangement where people have sort of simultaneous or concurrent opportunities or activities that they can engage in, allowing them to freely allocate their behavior to see where they would potentially select. Now, that's one potential way of approaching this, and it is complicated, because one of the things that I've heard a lot of people beginning to talk about is, if we measure assent based on allocation, so if a client approaches, let's say, the table where we're doing lessons, or the area that we're doing lessons, then therefore we can potentially interpret that as a form of assent if they don't have the ability to vocal verbally communicate that. So then a lot of people take it a step further and go, okay, but if they're not approaching the table, that must mean that they're dissenting or not assenting to the task, and therefore we shouldn't be doing it. And that's complicated and potentially a dangerous way of looking at the situation. And I always like to sort of give the example of a preschool classroom. If you've ever had your own children that are like preschool age, or if you've ever been into just a regular education preschool classroom, the kids are all over the place, right? You can't be like, hey, well, you got these two choices, and like, if you go to one, we're going to do it or not. Mm-hmm. And the kids are just going to rationally evaluate their options and choose. That's not how it works out. A lot of times you're having to sort of gently guide kids and teach them how to manage their own physical space and not interfere with other people's physical spaces and that whole thing. So it's much, much more complicated than simply looking at, oh, this client isn't engaging in this activity, therefore it's not assent, therefore we shouldn't be doing the procedure. There's a sort of a layer of considerations that people would have to make before jumping to conclusions like that.
Yeah. I never thought about it that way. Behavior allocation. Yeah. What would they select? That is a good thing to think about. Yeah. And I feel like with assent in anything, I just had, and I don't know if you ran into her at ABAI, Jennifer Posey on, and she was talking about the joy indicators, and she's working on some research around that, which I love. Because I think the thing is too, I always was taught, what is my client into today? And so I wouldn't ask my client that, but being a behavior analyst, I'm always analyzing, as I'm sure you are, does the client like this today? What are we doing next? Having many things out and ready for the student. I feel like, that can be really hard, because maybe one day they like X activity and maybe the next day they don't. But that may have stuff to do with what they were doing at home, and if they're satiated on an activity. And there's so much that goes into it. I think that's what I like, having these conversations, because I think as BCBAs, we are really modeling and then providing training for RBTs and other staff to implement different procedures. And I think some of this, obviously it's a science, but a lot of it is very nuanced, and you have to be, I think the thing too is what I'm realizing, with technology and everything. And I know that clinics have no phone rules, or, but you have to be 110% into the session. You have to be very focused. I know that's bringing it back to the elementary level, but I know that I've seen people, because I do consults and I work with a variety of people, you just have to be not checking your phone or email. You have to be 110% into the session, because what you're talking about is very nuanced. Don't you think it's hard to convey that to direct staff?
It absolutely is. And I loved your saying about, what are my clients into today, right? Because it is always changing. And, there are people that have talked about sort of the difference between a applied behavior analyst and a applied behavior procedurist, or someone who's sort of blankly following procedures.
Right.
And you're not looking at the context, you're not looking at the client, and you're not adapting. And that's when behavior analysts get themselves into trouble and ultimately are not providing effective services to their clients when they're stuck on these procedures. And I'm just following this procedure, and my client's showing me signs that this isn't going well today, and I'm not adapting because I'm just blindly following this procedure. And we have to do better than that. We cannot simply blindly follow a task analysis day in and day out without making adaptations to it, without looking at the context and adapting as necessary. We work with humans in a very complex environment, and we have to be able to adjust. It's just what is necessary to effectively meet people's needs. And I understand the complications with that, right? Because as you were saying, it is very nuanced. And if I could give a checklist of 10 things, and this is how we get assent with clients, and this is how we get clients fully involved with treatment decisions, by all means, I would have, come up with that checklist of the 10, and I would be trying to share it, screaming it from the mountaintops. But it is more nuanced than that. And there are so many variables related to it that we have to sort of keep in mind and try to balance everything out. I mean, again, if we look at a regular education classroom, the students in those classrooms aren't making every single choice about what they're experiencing day in and day out, right? They get a lot of choice in their day, as do our clients, but it's not realistic to think a child in particular should or is going to be able to make a choice for every single part of their day. I mean, I don't even make choices for every part of my day. I'm following my schedule. My schedule tells me what to do, and I just follow it. So,
decision fatigue, right? There's a lot of decision. Yeah. And I mean, I think I do that in my sessions too. I was talking about joint attention this week, but I said sometimes I use a book, and sometimes I'll give the student a choice between two books, and other times I say, oh, we're doing Pete the Cat today, or we're going to read Chicka Chicka Boom Boom. I think that it kind of goes back to, I mean, I guess I'd call myself seasoned now because I've been doing this 20 years and duly certified 10, but I think those are kind of things that do become, obviously we are utilizing ABA in our sessions, but some of those small minor decisions that we make as clinical educators are probably affecting our students and making every choice. So we don't want our clients to have decision fatigue either. Yeah. That's a good point.
Yeah. So I think if the goal is ultimately to help our clients be as involved with treatment decisions as possible and all layers of that treatment decision, like I said, treatment, goal planning, all of those components, which, by the way, is not a new idea in behavior analysis whatsoever. And so, a lot of people I've seen sort of cite my 2021 paper on assent in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis and say, oh, assent is this new thing in behavior analysis. It's really not. And I don't really deserve any credit for that. Because, Skinner talked about this in the 50s, like Beowulf and Risley sort of referred to the idea of social validity in treatment and the 68 paper, and Montrose Wolf elaborated on it in 78. Like there's a long history. Bannerman in the 1990s really fleshed this stuff out in terms of client involvement in treatment decisions. And so there's a rich history of behavior analysts thinking about client involvement in treatment decisions. It's really, the leaders in our field were talking about it. But it is complicated to do effectively. And so I understand the complications with it. Nevertheless, it is at the heart of behavior analysis. And so when people are maybe learning more details about more recent strategies or terminology or whatever it might be, I hope that they understand, like, this is what it means to be a behavior analyst, and to not focus on these variables really does not align with the fundamental components of being a behavior analyst.
Yeah. And as an aside, I think I saw that was one of your paper. You've done a lot of research. If you want to find some good research, please go to the BACB and look up Dr. Cody Morris. But I thought one of them was really interesting that I was going to ask you about is like maybe teaching the history of ABA, because was that something you did? Because I teach a class here at Kent State about ethics, which I really love that because it's I love it. It kind of works for my brain. But I've done that for about 5 years. And what I always do is, it's an online class, but I always kind of include some history about ABA because I feel like people that are coming out now, and this is not to say anything bad about any students, but I don't think people understand like the rich history that ABA has or who some of the very prominent people are in the field. Like, I really think that is lacking. I mean, I know in my coursework, like the first class that I took, we obviously went through a lot of the people that were in the field and just discussed their research and things like that. But I don't know. I mean, I know you're at the, in higher level education and maybe that's a focus of yours, but what was that paper about? I'm just kind of curious. When I read that, I was kind of like, oh, this is interesting.
Yeah. I mean, for me personally, I'm a history geek, period, like history broadly. And so as I got into behavior analysis, my interest in history and then behavior analysis sort of merged. And I began really to thoroughly look at the history of the field because there are so many lessons in history, in particular with our field. It's not that old of a field in general, right? As first a conceptualization and then a profession, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's really not that old. And so there are so many important lessons and there are so many important ideas that people have talked about that, sometimes get washed away with history and they come back and it's sort of a pendulum in terms of focuses, but looking at some of those lessons in the field. And so I was asked by Stephanie Peterson, my graduate school mentor, who was ultimately asked by Ed Morris, who no relation to me, is a professor at University of Kansas, who's like the authority of history and behavior analysis. Of course, it's ironic that I'm also interested in history and behavior analysis. But she was asked by Ed to be part of a symposium at ABAI talking about the history of behavior analysis. And so there were different focuses. So some people talked about the history of EAB or the history of the philosophy. And Stephanie was asked to talk about the history of the applied side of our field. And ultimately it was like, well, Cody's like the history geek here. Why don't I bring him aboard and he can help me flesh some of these things out, which we did together. And ultimately that paper is talking about the importance and the approach to teaching history of applied behavior analysis and graduate programs. And we use the history of punishment as an example of sort of lessons within history and ideas that people can and should potentially embed into their coursework to help people understand the history of how people have thought about punishment, really how that's impacted practice and sort of that whole development.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I'll have to give that a look. I'm excited about that. Thanks for sharing about that. So thinking about assent. So do you think that, just thinking for people that, I know this is not a new topic, but I feel like this is, I don't want to call it a buzzword, but I feel like it's something that a lot of people are talking about like it is something new, even though, Dr. Morris said it's not new. We've been talking about this for a long time. But should we have goals in our intervention plans for assent, or is this more like just really good application of the science? And I mean, obviously for speech therapists listening, I think this is super applicable for anybody, right? That's educating. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love this question. And to me, this question really gets at the idea on how we can sort of move forward into helping clients be involved as much as possible with treatment decisions, which is, should it be part of the treatment plans and really to what extent should it be? And so I think it would be difficult, again, to sort of give blank statements about, all decisions or X amount of decisions, and these are decisions. Like, it's more complicated than that, particularly when we're looking at individual skill set. Like, I do consultation with my students and sort of on the side, and a lot of stuff, ends up coming back to assent that I'm asked to consult with. And it's it's not as simple as me going, okay, well, like, let's just give them some choice here, and then like we can move forward.
Mm-hmm.
What I typically recommend is to embed assent or really choice related to treatment as much as possible, right? Look at the individual skill set and maximize the amount that they can participate in the treatment decisions given their skill set. And then consider, if appropriate, embedding lessons and training and learning opportunities related to gaining more decision-making skills and choice skills. Because I've been in a lot of clinics, and obviously behavior analysts and speech pathologists, for that matter, are oftentimes focusing on really critically important skills. But sometimes they're focusing on things that there's like fluff in the treatment plans, right? So they're like, we're having the client learn to label 100 different dinosaurs, and like dinosaurs, and they're not even that, into dinosaurs. It's not like that's their favorite thing. So like, yeah, let's have them learn it, right? It's just like, they're just having them learn to label stuff, which, don't get me wrong, may be important. But what's more important, learning 100 dinosaur names or learning to make important decisions that are going to immediately impact the quality of your life and the future quality of your life? And so you got to go with baby steps on these things. So if I have a client that doesn't have discrimination skills and isn't communicative, okay, well, I can't be like, okay, let me show you your 50-page behavior support plan and get your opinion on that, right? We got to start with small little things, like, how do you like this versus that, and small little increments, while helping them gain skills so they can make bigger decisions longer term. And I think that's very similar to how parents and other people help children with typically developing skills learn to make decisions, right? When you have a child that's in preschool, you don't tell them, like, hey, we're considering signing a mortgage and buying a house. Like, can you give me your thoughts on that? No, but what you might do as the kid is getting older, you might start explaining to them some of the basic finance stuff and like what money means. And we've got $1. How do we spend it at a store? And you work your way up to when they're, in their 20s, and you're signing buying a second home or buying a new home. At that point, you might have them a little bit more involved with that process so that they understand what it looks like, so that when they're ready, they have seen the process and can make a decision about buying home. We don't go straight from, never having looked at any of this or made any decisions to let's buy a home together.
Right. Yeah, I like the idea of maybe embedding it. And I feel like too, it's almost something like, for me, just thinking about it, like, how would I really use this in one of my sessions? I mean, and obviously I'm doing these things, but I think when you're younger in the field, at least for me, I would think like, oh, and I worked on goals like this, but it was like a program. Like when you said like, okay, we're working on a program. We actually went rogue when I worked at the Cleveland Clinic. We got reprimanded big time by the director because we started making our own programs, but that's another thing. But so sometimes you want to go rogue. You're like, this doesn't work. But it seems like, embedding these opportunities throughout the session, you could probably have a goal for that, but it's almost like, I like to think of things in type of like a framework. So it's not like this discrete trial, like, which one do you want and which one is it? Like that choice making, because I think the younger me that started in the field, and not even like, I just mean as a speech therapist, that is how I would have thought of choice making. But now that I've been in the field longer and talking with you, thinking it through, is like, let's say if you have a 30-minute session or an hour, as a speech therapist, maybe an outside clinic, this is something that you would have multiple opportunities to kind of embed within the session. It's not something per se that you're going to do 5 trials in a bunch, because I do a lot of consulting too. And I can see where some people may think like, oh, choice making. Okay, well, let's do 5 trials of choice making, but that's not really it. It's like, let's embed this skill and this strategy, because what you're saying is like, wow, how important for somebody to make a choice and to show assent about their daily life, right? And that can be really hard for kids who are not yet speaking. So I like this idea of really kind of building that foundation so that you're really strengthening those skills for the kids.
Yeah. And so like at the most practical level, for example, like if I end up working with a client who has really no substantial communication skills. Maybe they manned for like a couple of things if we're lucky. For a client like that, I'm going to have them involved with selecting the different. So if we're using, like, I do a lot of challenging behavior clinical work and research, right? So if we're doing something like functional communication training and there's an icon involved with it, selecting the icon, right? Getting exposed to different icons, selecting the icon.
Right.
Not necessarily assent. They're potentially assenting to the procedure if they select the icon with a control, but they're involved with a component of the treatment decision. In the meantime, I might be working with them on higher level discrimination skills so that they can ultimately evaluate multiple stimuli simultaneously, which is going to be an important piece of making decisions. Yeah. I'll be working with them on those skills and ultimately targeting the prerequisite skills that are going to be necessary for those larger decisions and enable them to ultimately make big decisions later on.
Yeah, I love that. Such important work you're doing. Where can people find out more about you and your work?
So I try to be active on LinkedIn. So if people are on LinkedIn, they can find me and friend request me or whatever that's called on LinkedIn, or follow me. ResearchGate, I publish my research on ResearchGate. People can check it out there. If people have individual questions, they're always welcome to email me as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It was great to connect.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Autism Outreach. If you enjoyed the show today, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode full of actionable strategies you can use in your therapy room. Write a review too. That would mean so much to me. I always love hearing from you. Have a specific topic that you want included on a future show? Reach out over on Instagram, ABA Speech by Rose, or visit me at www.abaspeech.org.